At E3 a few weeks ago, Todd Howard took the stage to talk about Fallout 76. The game had been announced 1 week earlier with a brief teaser trailer set to John Denver's crooning tones, but Bethesda's press conference offered actual concrete details. We now know 76 will be focused on multiplayer survival. We know it will be set in West Virginia, and we know it will emphasize settlement building, a system Bethesda Game Studios established in 2015's Fallout 4. As I watched Todd promote his team's game and marveled at the craftsmanship of that sick leather jacket, something occurred to me. I had only ever put 20 hours into Fallout 4. As with any of BGS's open-world titles, this is only a drop in a massive bucket. I hadn't reached the level cap or played any of the expansions or even completed the main storyline. So I've considered myself a Fallout fan for a long time. Fallout 3 is one of my favorite games, and I absolutely adore what Obsidian did with Fallout New Vegas. I even went back to the first two titles, which haven't aged that well, to see what Interplay and Black Isle did to get the series off the ground. But in 2015, I bounced off of Fallout 4. Maybe it was the packed schedule of fall releases or the numerous other games I was reviewing for work purposes, but for whatever reason, I spent a few fleeting days with Fallout 4 and quickly moved on. So now, with all of the excitement surrounding the upcoming Fallout entry and a brief lull in this year's major titles, I decided to retrace my footsteps, to give Fallout 4 another shot, to not only see what I've been missing out on, but to investigate why such a huge entry in one of my favorite series failed to grab me almost 3 years ago. Only 1 hour into my new playthrough, I remembered just how much Fallout 4 overwhelmed me in the first place. After emerging from Vault 111, returning to my home in Sanctuary Hills, and fighting through Concord with the Minutemen, I rediscovered the game's crafting system. This includes everything from modular weapon upgrades to numerous armor combinations, perk requirements to outfit enhancements. Even power armor is relegated to its own crafting tree and drastically changes combat when you don it. As someone who wore Fallout 3's T-51B armor religiously, it took me a while to think of the exosuits more as vehicles than just outfits. And of course, none of this is to mention Fallout 4's divisive workshops. If one feature serves as a microcosm for Fallout 4, it's this: a system that allows you to construct and modify your own wasteland outposts, complete with resources to manage and citizens to care for. You not only build your own house, but an entire town. If you devote time to creating numerous settlements, they'll eventually spread throughout the Commonwealth. 3 years ago, these elements were a major deterrent for me. They felt like Minecraft Lite tacked onto a game that didn't need it. To me, the Fallout world has always been about wandering, scavenging, living the life of a nomad in a dangerous American hellscape. To settle down meant to wither. To focus on specific plots of land meant to ignore the very freedom that made Bethesda's open world so appealing in the first place. But replaying Fallout 4 in the wake of community mods, workshop DLC packs, and an array of amazing YouTube videos, I vowed to give the settlement aspect a little more time, and in doing so, I fell in love with it. The controls and UI took a while to master, especially considering I was playing on PS4 as I owned all of the DLC on this platform. But once I got the hang of menu navigation, there was no looking back. I bolstered my defenses, I restored power to my living quarters, I even set up a quaint little diner where grateful patrons can relax after a hard day's work. Rebuilding these camps encourages creativity on its own, but also does a stellar job of feeding into the rest of the game. In order to create, you have to scavenge. In order to scavenge, you have to explore. And while exploring a dangerous wasteland, you'll likely get into a firefight or two, which then yields more materials for crafting. And that brings you right back to your hideouts to store your best loot. Fallout 4 settlements are the glue that holds these various mechanics together, and I can't imagine the game without them.
Gosh darn, it's good to see artillery here again.
To dig a little deeper, this focus on post-apocalyptic domestication also supports Fallout 4's narrative. While earlier Fallout games told stories of reconstruction, Bethesda's newest entry places the idea at the heart of things. In fact, most of the game's role-playing, which I'll get to shortly, centers around one major question: what do you want the wasteland to be? For instance, you can rebuild the Minutemen, the wasteland's protective militia. You liberate farms and defend drive-in theaters. You increase the group's influence over the Commonwealth until you retake the old fortress itself, reinforcing the castle with artillery, storefronts, and crops. Alternatively, you could aid the Railroad, a covert organization that smuggles synths to freedom, away from the totalitarian aims of the corporate institute. As with the Minutemen, you establish settlements in order to expand the Railroad network. By constructing outposts, you actively grow the group's reach. As you might imagine, I was borderline shocked to learn that the workshops were almost cut during development several times. According to NoClip's History of Bethesda video, the team saw it as ancillary to the overall experience, an ambitious endeavor that could have easily been abandoned. I'm glad it wasn't. It fosters my attachment to the Commonwealth Wasteland, serving a narrative purpose, but also giving me opportunities to put my own mark on the surroundings. Fallout 4's DLC doubled down on the workshops. Not only are there upgrades to your furniture, structures, and defenses, but also a whole story-based expansion in Nuka World, which allows you to help raider gangs in their bid for dominance. The DLC lets you build a raider empire, complete with its own settlements and hideouts. It would have made more sense to include this in the base game, fleshing out another faction in Fallout 4's role-playing framework, but nevertheless illustrates Bethesda's confidence in their crafting system. Really, my altered perception of the workshop system reflects my newfound appreciation for Fallout 4 as a whole. Looking back on it 3 years later allows me to place it in a new context. With more details about Fallout 76, I can see Fallout 4 as part of a gradual evolution that spans multiple developers. Interplay and Black Isle may have began the series as role-playing games, but since the 2008 release of Fallout 3, they've become something different. Open-world shooters with RPG elements. That's not to say you can't really roleplay in these games. There are always ample opportunities to create a character and stick to that persona. New Vegas in particular encourages you to build a framework of morals and motivations, and pushes you through its narrative with somewhat difficult choices. But by and large, Bethesda has pushed role-playing to the background, making more room for exploration, survival, and combat in the process. Following the series from Fallout 3 to the upcoming Fallout 76, you can see the developer increasingly focus on these three areas. They improved crafting and combat drastically in Fallout 4. They subsequently added survival mode to make the game more difficult. Almost every upgradable perk is geared toward fighting or crafting. And with Fallout 76, their marketing is stressing survival, crafting, and exploration over anything else. Any mentions of role-playing seem to arise as an afterthought. Placed in this evolutionary context, I think Fallout 4 is much, much better than I originally gave it credit for. Yes, it's rife with bugs, and on consoles, the frame rate drops low enough to still warrant a mention 3 years and numerous updates later. There are also myriad problems with the narrative, and I'm about to get to those. But consider 76's increased focus on multiplayer and survival. By all accounts, Bethesda should be running a huge risk of alienating long-term players such as myself. But not only does Fallout 4 convince me that Fallout 76 can fit logically into the series' evolution, it actively has me excited for it. And I say this as someone who puts past Fallout games on an unreasonably high pedestal. Which is all to say that now I can accept Fallout 4 for what it is and not what I want it to be. I can sit back, relax, and enjoy the way it pushes me between exploration, combat, scavenging, and crafting. I can take my time with the workshop system, expanding my factions across the Commonwealth. I can ignore the main storyline in favor of finding my own emergent anecdotes. Well, almost. My biggest problem with Fallout 4 is the way Bethesda struggles to tie its Golden Path narrative into its side quests whenever possible. I appreciate the team's attempts to do so, and it's a problem almost every open-world game shares. But it feels as if Bethesda tried to morph Fallout 4 into a hardcore RPG in the 11th hour. The story asks you to take sides in a conflict between the Brotherhood of Steel, the Corporate Institute, and the aforementioned Railroad, balancing the values and goals of each organization. For this playthrough, I sided with the Railroad, opting to help synths escape to freedom whenever possible. I love the subterfuge involved. I love how clandestine each mission feels. I love going behind the backs of the Institute and the Brotherhood, pulling strings to steer matters toward our righteous goal of liberty and justice for all. The problem is, each faction's motivations don't always clash in a logical way. Oftentimes, I would make a decision sure I was pissing off another group, but upon returning to its headquarters, I was welcomed with open arms. In other cases, I would stand on the precipice of a seemingly minor decision, only to have the game tell me I was about to alienate a faction entirely. It was in these moments that Fallout 4 tried to take too much control away from me, the player. Rather than showing me how my actions would affect the outcome, it opted to tell me instead. Had Bethesda found smoother ways to draw me toward the main story beats and more intuitive manners to pit various factions against each other, my enjoyment may have carried into every aspect of this sandbox. As it stands now, Fallout 4 feels like two separate games, a very poor RPG and a fantastic open-world shooter. But when the latter is so fantastic, it's kind of hard to complain. There's exceptional balance on display here in terms of scope. BGS has created not just an engrossing world, but an abundance of amazing levels placed within that world. Spending time in Nuka World's amusement park reminded me of a metaphor one of my editors used to use. If you're designing a theme park, not only do you have to select the best roller coasters possible, you have to arrange them in a pleasing way. In other words, balance the pieces as well as the path tying them all together. My editor was talking about sentence structure and article flow, but I think it works here too. It was 20 hours into my playthrough on the southwest corner of the map when I really knew Fallout 4 had nailed that balance. I was in the glowing sea where a nuke hit Massachusetts 200 years prior. Radiation levels were critical, supplies were scarce. I was vulnerable and I was having a blast. I came across a cave with power armor and a few welcome supplies shortly before wading into a thriving nest of lethal rad scorpions. There were no RPG elements or major story beats, just a dangerous world and the threat of death around every corner. This was Fallout 4 at its best. I'll be honest, when I set out to replay Fallout 4, I thought I would see it as I always have. A game whose reach far exceeds its grasp. A game with more ambition than it can handle, resting in a sort of purgatory before whatever comes next.
Till Monday, that's how the week can go. I've got a dream.
But now, 75 hours and 5 DLCs later, I sincerely want to keep playing. Parts of its design do feel very stagnant, and it doesn't do anything to revolutionize open worlds. And as with any BGS game, it is technically flawed to say the least. But in many ways, it is the pinnacle of what a Fallout game can be. A dangerous world frozen in time whose every corner is worth exploring.
Live and love in my hometown.